Warsaw, 1943. A single rifle shot echoes through the shattered streets of the Jewish ghetto, and a woman collapses mid-stride, her basket of smuggled potatoes scattering across the cobblestones. No one screams. No one runs to help her. The survivors have learned that movement draws the eye of death itself. A German SS sniper perched somewhere in the skeletal remains of an apartment building, invisible as a ghost, lethal as plague. For 6 weeks, this phantom has ruled these streets with surgical precision, dropping anyone who dares cross his kill zone. Resistance fighters have tried to locate him. They've failed. Polish Home Army spotters have scanned every window, every rooftop, every shadow. Nothing. The sniper is a legend of terror, and the people trapped in this hellscape have accepted a simple truth: you cannot fight what you cannot see. But on this particular morning, while SS patrols drag bodies from the rubble, and the scent of burning buildings chokes the air, a 13-year-old boy named Shimon crouches behind a collapsed wall, clutching something that will change everything. It's not a gun. It's not a grenade. It's a small rectangular mirror, no bigger than a playing card, that once belonged to his mother before she was taken to Treblinka. And in exactly 17 minutes, this piece of glass will turn an invisible executioner into a blind, panicked animal. The Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of 1943 was not a neighborhood. It was an open-air execution chamber, a 3.5-square-mile prison, where over 400,000 Jews had been crammed behind brick walls and barbed wire since 1940. By the time our story begins, the Great Deportation had already ripped through the population like a scythe through wheat. 300,000 people had been shipped to Treblinka in the summer of 1942 alone, loaded into cattle cars under the lie of resettlement. The 55,000 who remained were the remnants, the stubborn ones, the ones who had chosen to resist rather than march quietly into the gas. The ghetto looked like a vision of the apocalypse. Buildings stood as burned-out husks, their windows like empty eye sockets staring at nothing. Streets were cratered from German artillery. Corpses lay in doorways, covered in newspapers, because there was no one left to bury them. The air itself tasted of ash and decay. This was the world Shimon had been born into, though he barely remembered what came before the walls went up. He had been 8 when the Germans herded his family into this district, old enough to remember his father's bookshop on Nalewki Street, young enough to adapt to horror the way only children can. Shimon was small for his age, dark-haired, with eyes that had learned to see without being seen. Before the uprising began, he had been a runner for the Jewish combat organization, the Zombie, slipping through sewers and gaps in the wall to smuggle weapons and information. He was invisible by design and by necessity, a shadow among shadows, fluent in the language of survival that every ghetto child spoke. His mother had been deported 8 months earlier. His father had died of typhus the winter before that. He had an older sister, Raquela, who worked in one of the remaining forced labor shops, but he rarely saw her. The ghetto had a way of scattering families like seeds in a storm. What Shimon had now was the resistance, a ragtag collection of teenagers and young adults armed with smuggled pistols, homemade Molotov cocktails, and a single machine gun they had bought from a Polish black marketeer for a fortune in jewelry stripped from the dead. They had approximately 0 chance of winning a military victory against the Wehrmacht and SS forces that encircled them. But winning was not the point. Making the Nazis pay in blood for every inch of this cursed ground, that was the point. Dying with a weapon in your hand instead of naked in a gas chamber, that was the point. The sniper had appeared 3 days after the ghetto uprising exploded into open warfare on April 19th. German forces, expecting quick submission, had instead walked into ambushes, watched their tanks burn from Molotov cocktails thrown from rooftops, and took casualties they never anticipated from a starving, desperate enemy. Enraged, the SS commander Heinrich Himmler himself had ordered the complete liquidation of the ghetto, building by building, block by block. That's when the sniper arrived, a specialist brought in to break the spirit of the resistance. No one knew his name. Resistance members called him Der Schatten, the Shadow. He never missed. He never revealed his position. He would fire once, maybe twice, then vanish like smoke, only to reappear hours later from a completely different angle. He killed fighters and civilians without distinction, a woman hanging laundry, a man carrying water, a child running between doorways. The randomness was the point. The invisible threat was the point. Keep your head down, stay inside, stop resisting, or the shadow will find you. It was psychological warfare at its most refined, and it was working. Resistance fighters began to hesitate before crossing open ground. Civilians refused to leave their hiding places, even to search for food. The shadow was draining the will to fight more effectively than a battalion of soldiers ever could. Shimon had been studying the shadow for 2 days, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had nothing else to do and watching was what kept you alive. He had noticed something the older fighters had missed, something small but critical. The shadow never fired when the sun was directly in a certain quadrant of the sky. Between 10 in the morning and noon, when the sun tracked across the eastern side of the ghetto, the kill zone went silent. Shimon had marked the pattern in his mind, cross-referencing it with the buildings that still had intact upper floors on the eastern perimeter. There were only 4 candidates. The shadow had to be in one of them, and he had to be facing west to dominate the street below, which meant every morning for approximately 2 hours, the sun would be shining directly into his scope. That's when the idea had crystallized. The mirror had been his mother's, a small vanity compact she had kept in her coat pocket, a tiny luxury from a previous life. Shimon had found it in the rubble of their apartment after the deportations, and he had carried it ever since, not for sentiment, but because useful things should never be wasted. Now, crouched behind the shattered wall with the morning sun climbing into position, he realized he was holding a weapon more dangerous than any gun in the ghetto. The plan was insane, and Shimon knew it. He would expose himself in the shadow's kill zone, draw the shot, and in the single second before the rifle fired, he would angle the mirror to catch the sun and throw a concentrated beam of light directly into the scope. If he was right about the position, if the shadow was where Shimon thought he was, the sudden flash of magnified sunlight directly into the sniper's eye through his scope would be like staring into a welding torch. It would blind him, disorient him, maybe even burn his retina. It would give the resistance fighters waiting in the building across the street exactly one chance to spot the muzzle flash and return fire before the shadow relocated. If Shimon was wrong, if his calculations were off by even a single degree, the bullet would hit him center mass and he would die in the street like the woman with the potatoes. He was 13 years old. He had watched his entire world burn. He had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. So as the sun climbed into position, and the morning light turned the ruined ghetto into a landscape of sharp shadows and blinding brightness, Shimon stood up, stepped into the open street and waited for death to notice him. The moment Shimon stepped into the open, time seemed to fracture into 1,000 crystalline shards. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes locking onto him, could sense the microscopic adjustment of a rifle barrel tracking his movement across the cobblestones. Somewhere in the gutted buildings above, the shadow was making his calculations, compensating for wind that barely existed in the still morning air, adjusting for the distance that separated predator from prey. Shimon forced himself to walk slowly, naturally, like a boy who had simply miscalculated his route and wandered into the wrong street. His right hand was in his coat pocket, fingers wrapped around the small mirror, thumb positioned on the edge so he could flip it open in a fraction of a second. His left hand swung loosely at his side, playing the part of innocence even as every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to dive, to do anything except continue this suicidal march across the killing ground. He counted his steps. 1, 2, 3. The street was perhaps 20 meters across, an eternity of exposure. 4, 5, 6. Behind the third-floor window of the building to his right, he knew 3 resistance fighters were positioned with their stolen rifles, waiting for the moment the shadow revealed himself. 7, 8. The sun was a physical presence on his right shoulder, a burning weight that told him the angle was perfect. The timing was now or never. 9 steps. That's when Shimon heard it, or rather felt it, a change in the air pressure so subtle it was almost imaginary. The intake of breath before the universe screamed. His hand was already moving, ripping the mirror from his pocket, flipping it open with a practiced motion he had rehearsed 100 times in the dark corners of bombed-out basements. The The morning sun caught the glass surface and transformed into a weapon of pure light, a concentrated lance of brilliance that Shimon angled upward and to his left, sweeping it across the fourth-floor windows of the tallest remaining building on the eastern perimeter. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The light danced across shattered glass and empty frames, searching, hunting. Then Shimon saw it, a glint of metal in a window he had marked as a possibility, a scope that caught his reflected sunlight and magnified it, amplifying it, focusing it directly into the eye pressed against the lens. The rifle shot came, but it came wrong, the crack of the Mauser splitting the air half a second too late and 20 centimeters too high, the bullet screaming past Shimon's left ear so close he felt the heat of its passage. The shadow had flinched. The invisible god of death had blinked. And in that single moment of distraction, the three resistance fighters in the opposite building saw what they needed: the muzzle flash, the position, the exact window from which the shadow had ruled these streets for 6 brutal weeks. The resistance fighters opened fire immediately, a ragged volley of shots that shattered what remained of the window frame and sent plaster dust exploding into the air. Shimon didn't wait to see if they hit their target. He was already sprinting, legs pumping, the mirror abandoned in the street behind him as he threw himself toward the nearest doorway. Another shot cracked out from the shadow's position, wild and desperate, punching into the cobblestones where Shimon had been standing 2 seconds earlier. The sniper was firing blind now, wounded or panicked or both, and that was a kind of miracle in itself. A third shot, then silence. Shimon crashed through a doorway and into the burned-out shell of what had once been a bakery, his chest heaving, his hands shaking so badly he had to press them against the wall to stop the tremors. He could hear shouting now, German voices barking orders, the sound of boots on stairs as SS soldiers rushed to reinforce their sniper's position. The resistance fighters across the street had already abandoned their post, melting back into the maze of tunnels and hidden rooms that honeycombed the ghetto. They knew better than to stay and fight a battle they couldn't win. The objective had never been to kill the shadow. The objective had been to prove he could bleed. Word spread through the ghetto within hours, carried by runners who moved through the underground networks like blood through veins. The shadow had been forced to relocate. The invincible sniper had missed his shot. A 13-year-old boy with a mirror had done what trained soldiers could not. The story grew with each telling, as stories always do in desperate times. Some said Shimon had blinded the sniper permanently. Others claimed the shadow had been killed by the resistance fighters' return fire, though no body was ever found. What mattered was not the accuracy of the tale, but the effect it had on the people who heard it. Something impossible had happened. The machinery of German precision and terror had malfunctioned, if only for a moment, and that moment was enough to remember why they were fighting in the first place. The uprising would continue for another 3 weeks, a doomed but defiant stand that would cost thousands of lives and reduce the ghetto to literal ashes. But on that morning, in that street, with that small rectangular piece of glass, a boy had proven that even in the darkest pit of human cruelty, ingenuity and courage could still strike back against the machinery of death. Shimon never spoke about what he had done. There was no glory in survival, no medals awarded in a place where the only prize was living until tomorrow. He slipped back into the shadows where he belonged, just another ghost among ghosts, waiting for the next impossible task that would determine whether he saw another sunrise. The mirror remained in the street where he had dropped it, trampled by German boots during their frantic search for the boy who had humiliated their expert killer. But in the resistance cells and hidden bunkers, in the whispered conversations between exhausted fighters who knew they were already dead, the story of the boy and the mirror became something more than fact. It became proof that the human spirit, cornered and starving and facing annihilation, could still find weapons in the most unexpected places and strike back with devastating effect. The shadow did not die that day, and that reality hung over the ghetto like a toxic fog in the hours that followed Shimon's desperate gambit. By early afternoon, reconnaissance reports filtered back through the resistance network, confirming what everyone had feared, but no one wanted to admit. The sniper had relocated to a new position somewhere in the southern sector, and within 2 hours of his displacement, he had killed 3 more people, 2 of them fighters who had been celebrating prematurely in what they thought was safe territory. The message was clear and brutal. You can hurt me, you can make me move, but you cannot stop me, and I will make you pay for your defiance in blood. The Germans understood the psychological mathematics of occupation better than anyone. For every small victory the resistance achieved, the reprisal had to be disproportionate, overwhelming, designed to make people regret their courage and long for the comfortable numbness of submission. The Shadow's relocation was not a retreat, it was a recalibration. And now he was hunting with the focused rage of a predator who had been wounded by prey he had considered beneath his notice. Shimon learned about the 3 deaths from a runner named David, a 16-year-old with a pronounced limp from a German bullet that had shattered his ankle during the first days of the uprising. David found Shimon in the basement of a partially collapsed tenement building, one of dozens of improvised shelters where resistance members rotated to avoid establishing predictable patterns. The news hit Shimon like a physical blow, not because he had known the victims personally, though he recognized their names from previous operations, but because it confirmed what he had suspected the moment his mirror trick had worked. He had not solved the problem of the Shadow. He had only made the problem angrier. The sniper's new position was reportedly in a building that overlooked one of the last remaining water distribution points in the ghetto, a place where civilians had no choice but to expose themselves if they wanted to survive. It was a calculated cruelty, forcing people to choose between dying of thirst in hiding or dying from a bullet in the open. This was the nature of the beast they were fighting. The Germans did not simply want to kill Jews, they wanted to make the process of dying as psychologically torturous as possible to break the spirit before they broke the body. The resistance commanders held an emergency meeting that evening in a bunker beneath what had once been a hospital, now just another pile of rubble concealing a network of tunnels and hidden rooms. Shimon was not invited to attend, but he positioned himself near the entrance, where he could hear fragments of the heated debate echoing up through the ventilation shaft. The argument centered on a fundamental strategic question that had plagued the uprising from the beginning. Was it better to engage in symbolic acts of defiance that boosted morale, but accomplished little tactically? Or should they conserve their limited ammunition and personnel for operations that might actually damage the German war machine? Some commanders argued that Shimon's mirror trick, while impressive, had ultimately been a waste of Eve, aught that got 3 people killed for no strategic gain. Others countered that morale was a weapon in itself, that stories of resistance spread beyond the ghetto walls and inspired others, that dying with dignity was worth more than dying quietly. The discussion went in circles, as it always did, because both sides were right and both sides were doomed, and everyone in that bunker knew it. What no one discussed, because it was too painful to acknowledge openly, was the simple mathematical reality of their situation. The ghetto uprising had begun with approximately 750 fighters, armed with a mix of pistols, rifles, homemade explosives, and desperate courage. After 2 weeks of continuous combat, casualties and ammunition depletion had reduced their effective fighting force to perhaps 400. The Germans, by contrast, had access to unlimited reinforcements, artillery, flamethrowers, and the cold bureaucratic efficiency of a military machine that had conquered most of Europe. The resistance could win individual engagements, could inflict casualties, could make the Germans pay for every street and every building, but they could not win the war. The outcome was predetermined. The only variable was how much damage they could inflict before the inevitable end, and whether their sacrifice would be remembered or erased like so many other inconvenient truths that contradicted the Nazi narrative of Jewish passivity. Shimon understood this with the clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. He was not fighting to survive. He was fighting to ensure that when the Shadow finally put a bullet in him, it would not be while he was cowering in a corner, waiting for permission to die. The meeting broke up near midnight with no clear resolution, which was itself a kind of resolution. The resistance would continue doing what it had been doing, fighting when opportunities presented themselves, hiding when survival demanded it, and improvising weapons from whatever materials the ghetto's devastation provided. Shimon returned to his shelter and tried to sleep, but sleep was a luxury his mind refused to grant. He kept replaying the moment in the street, the weight of the mirror in his hand, the impossible gamble that had somehow worked. He thought about the 3 people who had died in the aftermath, wondered if they had families, if those families blamed him for drawing the shadow's rage. He thought about his mother's face, already fading from memory despite his efforts to hold on to it, and his father's voice reading from books in the shop that no longer existed. Mostly, he thought about the fact that the shadow was still out there, still killing, and that a mirror trick would not work twice. The sniper would be watching for it now, anticipating it, ready to counter it. If Shimon wanted to truly neutralize the threat, he would need something more than reflected sunlight. He would need a plan that the shadow could not predict, could not counter, could not survive. And in the darkness of that basement, listening to the distant rumble of German artillery reducing another block to rubble, the beginning of that plan began to take shape in his mind. The new plan crystallized over the next 36 hours, born from observation, desperation, and the kind of reckless calculation that only makes sense when you have already accepted your own death as a probable outcome. Shimon spent an entire day mapping the shadow's new hunting ground, watching from concealed positions, as the sniper methodically worked his territory around the water distribution point. The pattern was different now, more cautious, more unpredictable. The shadow no longer maintained a single fixed position. Instead, he rotated between 3 or 4 different vantage points, never firing more than 2 shots from any one location before relocating. It was a defensive adaptation, proof that Shimon's mirror attack had genuinely rattled the German shooter and forced him to abandon the arrogance that came from weeks of unchallenged dominance. But the rotation pattern revealed something crucial. The shadow was moving between positions during a specific window of time, roughly between 1 and 3 in the afternoon, when the sun's position made long-distance observation difficult and the streets were mostly empty due to the midday heat that still somehow managed to penetrate the smoke and ash that hung over the ghetto like a funeral shroud. Shimon's plan required 3 things: precise timing, suicidal courage, and a willingness to use himself as bait in a trap that might not work. He needed to catch the shadow during his relocation window, when the sniper was temporarily vulnerable and moving between his fortified positions. The goal was not to kill the shadow, which was beyond Shimon's capabilities with the resources available, but to identify his route of movement with enough precision that resistance fighters could set up an ambush using their precious remaining ammunition. The challenge was that to track the shadow's movement, someone needed to be in the open, visible, drawing attention while simultaneously observing from angles that could triangulate the sniper's position. It was a task that required the observer to be simultaneously exposed and invisible, a mathematical impossibility that Shimon solved by deciding he would be the exposure while others remained invisible. He would walk the streets during the rotation window, presenting himself as a target too tempting for the shadow to ignore, and in the seconds before the shot came, he would use the shadow's own predatory instincts against him by forcing the sniper to reveal not just his current position, but his direction of travel. The resistance commanders rejected the plan immediately when Shimon presented it through David, the limping runner who had become something of a liaison between the boy and the adult fighters who actually made decisions. They called it suicide with extra steps, a waste of a useful runner, and an insult to the people who had already died fighting with actual weapons instead of mirrors and foolish hope. But Shimon had anticipated the rejection, and he had no intention of seeking permission for something he had already decided to do. The ghetto had taught him a fundamental lesson that every child of occupation eventually learned. Authority only mattered when you believed in tomorrow, and tomorrow was a luxury none of them could afford. So he simply nodded when David relayed the commander's refusal, thanked him for trying, and then proceeded to gather the materials he would need for an operation that would happen with or without official sanction. He needed watchers positioned at specific intersections, people he could trust to observe without interfering, who would mark the shadow's movements and relay that information to fighters who could actually do something with it. Finding volunteers was surprisingly easy. The ghetto was full of people who had nothing left but the desire to be useful, to contribute something meaningful before the Germans finally succeeded in erasing them from existence. Shimon recruited a network of 5 watchers, 2 elderly men who had been tailors before the occupation, and possessed the kind of patient, detail-oriented observation skills that came from years of measuring inseams and checking stitching. A woman in her 30s named Esther, who had lost her entire family in the deportations and now moved through the ruins with the detached calm of someone who had already died inside, and 2 other children, Bori. Fez, slightly younger than Shimon, who understood that childhood had ended the moment the walls went up, and who wanted desperately to prove they were more than victims waiting to be processed. He positioned them at 5 key intersections surrounding the water distribution point, gave each of them specific instructions on what to look for, and established a simple signal system using hanging fabric in windows to communicate the shadow's direction of movement. The system was crude, easily disrupted, and depended entirely on the shadow following a predictable rotation pattern. It was also the best chance they had. The operation was scheduled for the following afternoon, during the window when the shadow typically relocated between positions. Shimon spent the morning in a kind of meditative preparation, not praying because he had stopped believing in a God who would permit places like the Warsaw Ghetto to exist, but rather centering himself in the reality of what he was about to do. He thought about his mother and father, not with sadness but with a kind of calm acceptance. They were gone. He would likely join them soon. The only question was whether his death would mean something or would simply be another statistic in the industrial slaughter machine the Germans had constructed. He checked and rechecked his route through the streets, memorized the positions of his watchers, and tried to calculate how many seconds he would have between the moment the shadow spotted him and the moment the bullet arrived. The mathematics of survival had become his entire world, reduced to angles and timing, and the narrow space between heartbeats where life and death negotiated their eternal transaction. And when the sun reached its apex and began its slow descent toward afternoon, Shimon stepped once again into the open street, walking deliberately into the crosshairs of a killer who had already learned that underestimating a 13-year-old boy with nothing to lose was a mistake he would not make twice. The afternoon sun was a white disk burning through the haze of smoke that never fully cleared from the ghetto air, and Shimon felt its heat on the back of his neck as he began his walk through the killing zone. He had chosen a different route this time, one that would force the shadow to track him across a longer distance, maximizing the window of exposure while simultaneously creating more opportunities for his watchers to triangulate the sniper's position. His hands were empty, deliberately so because he wanted the shadow to see him as helpless, to see a boy who had gotten lucky once with a mirror trick, but now had nothing except the foolish courage of youth. The street was eerily silent, that particular quality of quiet that comes when every living thing has learned to hold its breath and wait for violence to pass. Shimon could feel the eyes of his watchers on him from their hidden positions, could imagine them pressed against walls and peering through cracks in boarded windows, waiting for the signal that would tell them the shadow had taken the bait. He counted his steps again, a ritual that had become superstition, as if the universe cared about the number of footfalls a Jewish boy made before a German bullet found him. 15 steps into the open ground, Shimon saw the first signal, a strip of white cloth appearing in a third-floor window 2 blocks to his right, visible for 3 seconds before disappearing. The shadow had spotted him and was tracking from the eastern building, exactly where Shimon had predicted based on the sun's position and the sniper's need for optimal lighting. Good. That meant the pattern was holding, which meant the shadow was still following a rotation schedule that prioritized shooting conditions over unpredictability. 20 steps. 25. Shimon adjusted his pace, slowing slightly to give the shadow more time to commit to the shot, to invest in the kill enough that breaking away would feel like a waste of the setup. The psychological component of sniping was something Shimon had learned from observation and from listening to resistance fighters who had trained in the Polish army before the invasion. A sniper's greatest enemy was not counterfire, but the sunk cost of a perfect shot that never materialized. Once you had acquired your target, adjusted for distance and wind, controlled your breathing and found that meditative state where the rifle becomes an extension of your will, abandoning the shot felt like failure. The shadow had invested 6 weeks in terrorizing this ghetto. His pride would not allow a 13-year-old to walk through his domain untouched twice. 30 steps. A second signal appeared, this time a dark piece of fabric in a window to Shimon's left. the watching tailor marking a secondary position. The shadow was using a building that gave him overlapping fields of fire, which meant he had learned from the previous encounter and established backup positions in case he needed to relocate under fire. Smart, professional. Exactly the kind of tactical adaptation that made him so dangerous and so difficult to counter. But it also meant he was confident in his setup, which meant he would take the shot. Shimon could feel it now, that electric sensation of being observed through magnified optics, the sensation of having your entire existence reduced to a point of intersection between crosshairs. His body wanted to run, wanted to dive for cover, wanted to do anything except continue this insane march across open ground. But running would break the spell, would signal to the shadow that this was a trap, and the entire operation would collapse into wasted effort and missed opportunity. So Shimon forced his legs to maintain their steady pace, forced his breathing to remain calm, and trusted that the watchers were doing their job and that somewhere in the ruins behind him, resistance fighters were receiving the signals and preparing to move. The shot came at 37 steps, and it came from a direction Shimon had not anticipated. Not from the eastern building, but from a position almost directly ahead, a third location his watchers had not covered, because the sight lines seemed impossible from that angle. The shadow had outplayed him, had recognized the observation network, and deliberately fired from a blind spot to teach the resistance that their tricks were predictable and their attempts at tactical sophistication were the flailing of amateurs against a master. The bullet missed Shimon's head by less than 5 centimeters, so close that he felt the sonic crack as the round broke the sound barrier next to his ear, a sensation like being slapped by God's own hand. Shimon's body reacted before his mind could process, dropping into a forward roll that turned his momentum into evasion. The motion so instinctive, it had to have been written into his DNA by 3 years of living under constant threat. He came up running, legs pumping in a desperate sprint toward the nearest doorway, while 2 more shots cracked out, the shadow firing rapidly now, abandoning precision for volume in an attempt to catch the boy before he reached cover. Shimon hit the doorway at full speed and crashed through into darkness, his shoulder slamming into a wall hard enough to send sparks of pain shooting down his arm. Behind him, he could hear the sharp reports of return fire as his resistance fighters engaged from their positions, not because they had a clear shot at the shadow, but because they needed to create suppressing fire to cover Shimon's escape. The entire plan had failed. The shadow had anticipated the observation network, had changed his pattern specifically to counter it, and had nearly killed Shimon in the process of demonstrating his superiority. But as Shimon pressed his back against the wall and tried to calm his racing heart, as he listened to the sound of gunfire echoing through the ruined streets, he realized something that made the terror and the failure worth enduring. The shadow had broken his own rules. He had fired 3 shots from a single position, had allowed emotion to override discipline, had let the desire to kill this particular boy cloud his professional judgment. And in those 3 shots, in that brief window of revealed position, Shimon's watchers had finally, definitively identified the building where the shadow had established his primary nest. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. The resistance struck the shadow's nest at 4 in the morning, during that dead hour when human vigilance falls to its lowest ebb, and even trained soldiers succumb to the gravitational pull of exhaustion. The assault team consisted of 8 fighters, among them some of the most experienced urban combat veterans the ghetto resistance could field, men and women who had survived the initial deportations and had chosen to transform their rage into cold, tactical precision. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness like smoke, utilizing the tunnel network that connected basements beneath buildings the Germans believed they had cleared and secured. The intelligence Shimon's watchers had provided was specific enough to be actionable. The Shadow's primary position was on the 4th floor of a former textile factory, a building the Germans had reinforced with sandbag positions and machine gun emplacements on the ground level. The sniper himself operated alone on the upper floor, isolated by design and by the arrogance that came from believing himself untouchable. The resistance had no illusions about capturing him alive or even killing him definitively. The objective was simpler and more psychologically valuable: to penetrate his sanctuary, to prove that nowhere in this ghetto was safe for the occupiers, and to force the shadow to understand that the hunted had become hunters. The assault itself lasted 11 minutes from initial breach to final extraction, a masterpiece of coordinated violence executed by people who had learned to fight not from military manuals, but from 3 years of desperate survival against impossible odds. The resistance fighters bypassed the ground floor entirely, emerging from a tunnel into the building's basement and then ascending through a service stairwell the Germans had failed to properly secure. They encountered a single guard on the 3rd floor, an 18-year-old SS conscript who died before he could raise the alarm, his throat cut by a resistance fighter who had been a rabbinical student before the occupation taught him different skills. The team reached the 4th floor and breached the sniper's room, using a grenade stolen from a German supply depot, the explosion tearing through the doorway and filling the space with shrapnel and concussive force. What they found in the aftermath was both disappointing and illuminating. The shadow was not there. The room contained his equipment, his spare ammunition, his carefully arranged firing positions with meticulous range cards, marking distances to key points throughout the ghetto, but the man himself had already relocated. He had anticipated the assault, or perhaps simply followed a rotation schedule so disciplined that chance had saved his life. Either way, the resistance fighters had missed their primary target. But what they found in that room was worth more than a single dead sniper. The range cards, the maps, the intelligence documents that detailed German patrol routes and SS communication protocols, these were treasures of information that the resistance had been operating without for weeks. They grabbed everything they could carry, photographs and papers and notebooks, that documented not just the Shadow's operations, but broader German tactical planning for the ghetto's complete liquidation. Among the documents was a personal journal, written in precise German script, that detailed the Shadow's kill count with the dispassionate efficiency of an accountant recording transactions. 83 confirmed kills in 6 weeks. Men, women, children, resistance fighters, civilians, each entry marked with a date and time and distance. The journal read like a ledger of genocide rendered in clinical detail, proof that for the Shadow, murder was not an act of passion or even hatred, but simply a job performed with professional excellence. One of the resistance fighters, a woman named Hannah who had lost her husband in the first week of the uprising, held the journal in her hands and wept, not from sadness, but from a rage so pure it had transcended emotion and become something closer to religious revelation. The team extracted through the same tunnel they had used to enter, collapsing sections behind them to prevent German pursuit. They emerged 3 blocks away as the sun was beginning to rise, carrying their stolen intelligence like sacred relics. Behind them, they could hear the eruption of chaos as German forces responded to the breach, SS officers screaming orders and regular Wehrmacht soldiers scrambling to secure a position they had believed was impregnable. The Shadow would return to find his sanctuary violated, his secret stolen, his myth of invincibility further eroded by an enemy he had been taught to view as subhuman and incapable of sophisticated military action. The psychological impact was incalculable. The resistance had not killed the Shadow, but they had done something potentially more valuable. They had gotten inside his head, had proven that his preparations and precautions were insufficient, that the distance he maintained between himself and his victims could be crossed by people determined enough to pay the cost. Shimon learned about the raid's success from David, who found him in his shelter as morning light began to filter through the cracks in the boarded windows. The limping runner was grinning, a rare expression in a place where smiles had become extinct, and he carried a piece of paper that he handed to Shimon with something approaching reverence. It was a page torn from the Shadow's journal, a single entry dated 2 days earlier. The entry described a shot taken at a young male, estimated age 12 to 14, range approximately 40 meters. Result, miss due to target evasion. The annotation included a single word in German, Wiederholung, repetition. The Shadow had logged his failure to kill Shimon twice, had marked it as a pattern worth noting, which meant the boy was no longer just another target. He had become a problem that needed solving, a loose end that offended the sniper's sense of professional completion. Shimon read the entry 3 times, feeling something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. The shadow was hunting him specifically now, which meant the dynamic had shifted from cat and mouse to something more complex. They were locked in a duel that could only end when one of them was dead, and Shimon understood with absolute clarity that the next encounter would be the last. One of them would not walk away. The final confrontation came not through planning, but through the cruel mathematics of coincidence and necessity. 4 days after the raid on the Shadow's Nest, the ghetto's water situation reached a critical threshold that transformed a logistical problem into an immediate survival crisis. German forces had systematically destroyed or contaminated all but 2 functioning wells in the entire district, and one of those remaining sources had been poisoned overnight with what resistance scouts suspected was industrial chemicals dumped deliberately to force the population into the open. That left a single water access point, a courtyard well in what had once been a synagogue, now just another pile of broken masonry with a concrete basin at its center. Every person still alive in the ghetto knew where it was, which meant the Germans knew that everyone knew, which meant the well had become the ultimate killing ground, a place where human biology would override tactical caution and drive people into the open regardless of the danger. The Shadow had relocated there within hours of the other well being poisoned, establishing himself in a position so dominant and so perfectly situated that approaching the water required crossing nearly 50 meters of open ground with no cover and no concealment. It was a death sentence with a 3-day timer, and everyone understood that choices had now been reduced to dying from thirst or dying from a bullet. Shimon had not intended to be the one who broke the stalemate, but intention had ceased to matter weeks ago, in a place where survival was determined by chance and the cruel whims of circumstance. He had been searching through the ruins of an apartment building, looking for anything useful among the scattered possessions of people who were either dead or deported, when he found something that changed everything. It was a metal serving tray, perhaps 30 centimeters across, polished silver now tarnished black from smoke and age. But when Shimon wiped away the grime, he discovered that beneath the oxidation, the surface was still reflective, still capable of catching and redirecting light. He held it up to a shaft of sunlight penetrating through the collapsed roof and watched as the reflected beam danced across the far wall. The mirror trick had worked once because the Shadow had not expected it. Using it again would be suicide, because the sniper would be watching for exactly that kind of improvisation. But Shimon was not planning to use the tray as a mirror. He was planning to use it as a shield. And the idea was so absurd and so desperate that it might actually work precisely because no rational person would attempt something so obviously doomed to failure. The physics were simple, even if the execution would be nearly impossible. A rifle bullet traveled at approximately 750 meters per second, which meant at 50 meters distance, the bullet would arrive roughly 67 milliseconds after the trigger pull. Human reaction time, even for a trained soldier, was approximately 250 milliseconds from visual stimulus to physical response. That meant Shimon could not react to seeing the muzzle flash, because by the time his brain processed the visual information and commanded his body to move, the bullet would have already arrived and either killed him or missed. But he did not need to react to the shot. He needed to predict where the Shadow would aim and position the serving tray to intercept the bullet before it reached his body. It was a gamble built on assumptions about the Shadow's training and targeting priorities. Military snipers were taught to aim for center mass, the largest target area with the highest probability of a kill. The human torso presented approximately 30 centimeters of width at the shoulders, narrowing to perhaps 25 centimeters at the waist. If Shimon held the tray vertically in front of his chest while moving toward the well, there was a statistical possibility, perhaps as high as 30%, that the Shadow's first shot would hit the metal instead of flesh. 30% was not good odds, but they were better than the 0% chance of getting water without crossing that courtyard. Shimon spent 2 hours preparing, not physically but mentally, running through the scenario over and over until he could visualize every step of the approach. He would move at a steady walk, not running because erratic movement made accurate shooting easier rather than harder at close range. He would hold the tray centered on his chest cavity, angled slightly downward to account for the Shadow's elevated position. He would not look toward the sniper's likely position because eye contact, even at distance, triggered predatory instincts in hunters. And most critically, he would not stop or hesitate once he committed to the approach, because the moment between steps was when shooters took their shots, when the target was momentarily stationary and the crosshairs could settle. The plan was insane. It was also the only plan that offered any chance of success, which in the Warsaw Ghetto of 1943 made it the most rational option available. Shimon emerged into the courtyard at noon, when the sun was directly overhead and shadows were compressed to nothing, when the light was harsh and flat and perfect for long-range shooting. He carried no water container because he would not live long enough to fill one if the plan failed, and the weight would only slow him down. The serving tray was heavy in his hands, solid metal that had probably served hundreds of Sabbath dinners before the world ended and turned religious objects into instruments of survival. He took his first step into the open and felt the familiar sensation of being observed through magnified optics, felt the weight of invisible attention settling onto him like a physical burden. The shadow was watching, calculating, preparing. And somewhere in the ruins of the former synagogue, concealed in the rubble and the shadows, the most dangerous sniper in the Warsaw Ghetto was making the final adjustments to a shot that would either kill a 13-year-old boy or confirm that Jewish resistance, however futile, could still manifest in forms that defied every assumption about what conquered people were capable of achieving. Shimon walked forward, the tray held before him like a knight's shield carried into battle, and waited for the universe to decide whether courage and desperate ingenuity were enough to overcome German engineering and professional military training. The answer would arrive in less than a second, traveling at the speed of a bullet. The first shot arrived exactly as Shimon had predicted, aimed center mass, precisely calibrated for the kill, and it struck the serving tray with a sound like a church bell being hit with a hammer. The impact was so violent it nearly tore the tray from Shimon's hands, the force of the bullet transferring through the metal and into his arms with enough energy to send shock waves up to his shoulders. The tray now had a massive dent in its center. The bullet embedded halfway through the metal, stopped just millimeters short of penetrating completely and continuing its journey into Shimon's chest. For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to pause in astonishment at what had just occurred. A Jewish child had just blocked a rifle bullet with a serving tray. The shadow, somewhere in his concealed position, would be experiencing a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, his entire understanding of how this hunt should proceed disrupted by an outcome that violated every principle of ballistics and tactical certainty. But Shimon did not pause to marvel at his survival. He had predicted that the shadow would need approximately 4 seconds to cycle the bolt on his Mauser rifle, eject the spent casing, chamber a new round, reacquire the target through his scope, and fire again. 4 seconds was an eternity and no time at all. He used those seconds to sprint forward, abandoning the steady walk for pure, desperate speed, closing the distance to the well while the shadow processed his failure and prepared for the follow-up shot. The second shot came as Shimon reached the 20-meter mark, and this one was different. The shadow had adjusted his aim point, targeting not center mass but the legs, attempting to disable rather than kill because a wounded target was easier to finish than a moving one. But the adjustment required the shadow to shift his scope's elevation, and at 50 meters the margin for error was microscopic. The bullet struck the ground 15 centimeters to Shimon's left, sending up a spray of pulverized brick and concrete dust. It was a miss, the second miss the shadow had recorded against this particular target, and Shimon knew with absolute certainty that the sniper would now be experiencing something he had likely not felt in years of professional killing: doubt. The myth of his own infallibility was cracking, and every additional second that Shimon remained alive widened that crack into a chasm, 10 meters from the well now. The courtyard felt infinite, an expanse of open ground that seemed to stretch toward a horizon that kept receding. Shimon's lungs burned from the sprint, his arms ached from holding the dented tray, and every instinct in his body screamed that the third shot would be the one that found its mark, because even a rattled sniper could not miss 3 times at this distance. The third shot never came, and the reason why became apparent only when Shimon heard the staccato crack of rifle fire erupting from multiple positions around the courtyard perimeter. The resistance had launched a coordinated assault on the Shadow's position, using Shimon's suicidal approach as the trigger for an ambush they had been planning since the intelligence raid 4 days earlier. 3 separate fire teams had positioned themselves overnight in buildings surrounding the former synagogue, waiting for the Shadow to reveal himself by taking a shot at whatever desperate soul attempted to reach the water. Shimon had not known about the ambush because the resistance commanders had learned that he could not be trusted to follow orders when he decided an operation was necessary. They had used him as bait without his knowledge or consent, which in any other context would have been an unforgivable betrayal, but in the Warsaw Ghetto was simply pragmatic tactical planning. The resistance fighters were not shooting to kill the Shadow, which was nearly impossible against a fortified position with limited ammunition, but to suppress him, to force him to choose between maintaining his shot on Shimon or taking cover from incoming fire. It was exactly the kind of impossible choice that broke the decision-making loop of even the most disciplined soldiers. Shimon reached the well and threw himself behind its low concrete wall, the serving tray clattering to the ground beside him as he pressed his back against the stone and tried to remember how to breathe. Around him, the courtyard had transformed into a war zone, bullets cracking through the air and impacting against stone, with sharp reports that echoed off the surrounding ruins. The Shadow was returning fire now, his shots no longer measured and precise but rapid and defensive, aimed at suppressing the resistance positions rather than scoring kills. This was no longer hunting, this was survival. Through the chaos, Shimon could hear shouting in German, SS troops responding to the firefight and moving to reinforce the sniper's position. The resistance fire teams would have perhaps 30 seconds before they needed to extract or face being overrun by superior numbers and firepower. But 30 seconds was enough. In that brief window, the balance of power in the ghetto had shifted in a way that could not be quantified, but could definitely be felt. The Shadow had been forced to retreat, forced to prioritize his own survival over the kill, forced to acknowledge that the prey he had hunted for weeks had developed teeth. The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun, the resistance fighters melting back into their tunnel network and hidden routes, leaving behind only spent shell casings and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Shimon remained behind the well wall for several minutes after the shooting stopped, waiting to see if the Shadow would attempt one final shot now that the suppressing fire had ceased. But no shot came. Either the sniper had relocated or he was waiting for Shimon to expose himself, and Shimon had not survived this long by making predictable moves. So he waited, and while he waited he reached over the well's edge and lowered a bucket on a rope, drawing up water that was probably contaminated and almost certainly unsafe, but was still the most precious substance on earth to people dying of thirst. He drank deeply, feeling the lukewarm liquid fill his stomach, and only then did he retrieve the dented serving tray and examine the embedded bullet. It was a standard 7.92mm round, the kind used in German Mauser rifles, perfectly preserved in the metal like an insect trapped in amber. Shimon pried it loose with his fingers and held it up to the light, this small piece of lead and copper that had been intended to end his life but had instead become a trophy. He slipped it into his pocket, collected the bucket of water, and began the dangerous journey back across the courtyard, moving in an unpredictable zigzag pattern that would make the Shadow's job harder if he was still watching. No shot came, and when Shimon finally reached cover and looked back at the well he had just conquered, he understood that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between hunter and hunted. The Shadow was no longer invincible, and Shimon was no longer just surviving. He was winning. The Shadow disappeared from the ghetto entirely after the well confrontation, and his absence was more unnerving than his presence had ever been. For 3 days, no sniper fire echoed through the ruins, no impossible shots dropped fighters in mid-stride, no phantom death haunted the open streets. The resistance initially celebrated what they interpreted as a victory, believing they had either killed the Shadow during the firefight or wounded him badly enough to force his evacuation. But Shimon knew better. He had seen enough of German tactical doctrine to understand that when a weapon stopped working, they did not abandon it, they upgraded it. The Shadow had not been defeated. He had been recalled, either for reassignment or for a strategic reassessment of how to break the Resistance's increasingly effective adaptation to his methods. The silence was not peace. It was the operational pause before something worse arrived. And Shimon spent those 3 days preparing for the inevitable escalation, knowing that the Germans never allowed small humiliations to go unanswered, that every resistance victory was simply the down payment on a larger reprisal that would be calibrated to crush morale and restore the proper order of predator and prey. The German response came on the 4th day, and it came with the mechanical efficiency that characterized everything the Nazi regime did when it decided to solve a problem through overwhelming force. SS Commander Jürgen Stroop, the officer responsible for the ghetto's liquidation, issued an order that every building within 200 meters of the well would be systematically burned to the ground using flamethrowers and incendiary grenades. The objective was not tactical but psychological, to demonstrate that Jewish ingenuity and courage, however impressive, were ultimately irrelevant against an enemy with infinite resources and zero moral constraints. The resistance could win individual engagements, could embarrass German specialists, could inspire hope among the desperate and the dying, but they could not change the fundamental mathematics of industrial genocide. The burnings began at dawn, German soldiers moving methodically from building to building, setting fires that consumed wood and fabric and flesh with equal indifference. Families hiding in basements were either incinerated alive or forced into the open where they were shot or rounded up for deportation. The smoke that rose from the ghetto that day was so thick it could be seen from central Warsaw, a black pillar that marked the location where human civilization had collapsed into barbarism so complete it defied the vocabulary of ordinary evil. Shimon watched the fires from a shelter nearly half a kilometer away, forced to retreat further into the shrinking territory the resistance still controlled. The water source was gone now, rendered inaccessible by a perimeter of flame and German troops who shot anything that moved. He had saved perhaps 24 people by providing water during those 3 days when the well was accessible, had distributed the liquid like a priest offering communion to the condemned. But 24 people saved meant nothing against the hundreds who were dying daily from the intensified German assault. The uprising was entering its final phase, the period when even symbolic resistance became impossible, because the infrastructure needed to sustain human life had been systematically destroyed. Food was gone, water was gone, ammunition was nearly exhausted, medical supplies had never existed. The resistance fighters who remained were operating on nothing but will, and the knowledge that every additional hour they survived was an hour of defiance that contradicted the Nazi narrative of Jewish passivity. They were not fighting to win, they were fighting to be remembered as people who had fought. The Shadow returned on the 7th day after the well incident, but he returned different. Intelligence reports from Polish contacts outside the ghetto brought word that the original sniper had indeed been reassigned, transferred to the Eastern Front, where his skills were needed against Soviet forces who fought with the resources of a superpower rather than the desperation of a dying ghetto. But the Germans had replaced him with something worse, a team of 3 snipers, working in coordinated rotation, covering overlapping fields of fire that made the kind of tricks Shimon had employed impossible to repeat. They did not hunt for glory or maintain the professional pride that had made the original Shadow predictable. They simply killed, mechanically and without personality, reducing the act of murder to an industrial process as efficient as the gas chambers at Treblinka. Shimon heard about their arrival from the resistance network, heard about the 6 fighters who had died in the first 12 hours of the new sniper's deployment, and he understood that his role in this story was finished. He had accomplished something impossible, had forced the Germans to acknowledge that even a 13-year-old with a mirror and a serving tray could disrupt their operations if he was brave enough or crazy enough to try. But bravery had limits, and the Germans had demonstrated they would always escalate beyond those limits. On the night of May 15, 1943, Shimon joined a group of resistance fighters who were attempting to escape the ghetto through the sewer system, part of a desperate evacuation plan to preserve what remained of the combat organizations before the final liquidation made escape impossible. The journey through the sewers was a nightmare of claustrophobia and toxic gas, crawling through pipes barely wide enough for a human body, while German troops above them detonated explosives in an attempt to collapse the tunnels and bury the escapees alive. Shimon lost track of time in the darkness, lost count of how many turns they took through the underground labyrinth, focused only on the feet of the person in front of him, and the knowledge that stopping meant dying in sewage beneath the city that had once been his home. They emerged finally in the Aryan side of Warsaw, in a neighborhood where Polish people lived something resembling normal lives, while just a few kilometers away, the ghetto burned. Shimon stood in an alley, covered in filth, blinking in the daylight like something born from the underworld, and tried to process the fact that he had survived when so many had not. The serving tray was gone, lost somewhere in the tunnels, but the bullet he had pried from its surface was still in his pocket, a small piece of metal that weighed nothing and meant everything. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was officially crushed on May 16, 1943, when SS Commander Stroop ordered the destruction of the Great Synagogue on Tlomaki Street as a symbolic conclusion to the operation. The blast could be heard across the city, a final punctuation mark on 27 days of resistance that had cost the Germans more casualties than they had anticipated and far more time than they had allocated for what was supposed to be a simple deportation operation. Official German records claimed total victory, documented the deaths and deportations with characteristic bureaucratic precision, and filed the incident as a minor footnote in the larger campaign of the final solution. But those records could not document what actually mattered, could not quantify the psychological impact of watching starving teenagers with improvised weapons hold off a modern military force for nearly a month, could not measure the value of stories that spread through occupied Europe about Jewish resistance that fought back, instead of walking quietly into the gas. The ghetto itself was reduced to rubble, systematically demolished over the following months, until nothing remained except flattened ground where a community of hundreds of thousands had once lived. The Germans wanted to erase not just the people, but the memory of the place, to create a blank space on the map where inconvenient history could be forgotten. Shimon survived the war, though the word survived barely captures the complexity of what he endured in the years that followed his escape from the ghetto. He lived in hiding on the Aryan side of Warsaw, moving between safe houses operated by Polish resistance members who risked their own lives to shelter Jewish refugees. He witnessed the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when the Polish Home Army rose against the Germans in a doomed revolt that echoed the Ghetto Uprising in its courage and its tragedy. He watched the Red Army liberate Warsaw in 1945 and then impose Soviet occupation that replaced one form of tyranny with another. And through all of it, he carried the bullet in his pocket, a talisman from a life that felt increasingly like something that had happened to a different person in a different world. After liberation, Shimon learned the fate of those he had known in the ghetto. His sister Rakela had died during the final German assault, killed by flamethrower fire while defending a bunker. David, the limping runner who had been his liaison to the resistance commanders, had been captured and executed. Of the 750 fighters who had begun the uprising, perhaps 50 survived to see liberation. The numbers were abstract, insufficient to convey the weight of the loss, but numbers were all that remained when memory proved inadequate. In 1947, Shimon emigrated to Palestine, part of the wave of Holocaust survivors who sought to build new lives in a land that promised to be a refuge from the anti-Semitism that had destroyed European Jewry. He changed his name, as many survivors did, wanting to leave behind the identity associated with trauma and death. He married, had children, built a life that looked normal on the surface while carrying depths of experience that could never be fully shared with people who had not lived through the ghetto. He rarely spoke about his experiences, not because he wanted to forget, but because language felt insufficient to the task of conveying what he had witnessed and endured. The bullet remained in a drawer, shown occasionally to his children when they asked about his past, but always returned to darkness and silence. He worked as a teacher, educating a generation of Israeli children about history and mathematics, passing on knowledge while carefully curating which parts of his own history to reveal. And for decades his story remained untold except in fragments, another piece of testimony, buried in archives alongside millions of other stories from people who had experienced the Holocaust and then had to find ways to continue living afterward. The story of the boy who blinded a Nazi sniper with a mirror and blocked a bullet with a serving tray became one of those historical footnotes that serious scholars documented, but popular memory largely forgot. It appeared in a few academic texts about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, usually as a minor anecdote illustrating the resourcefulness of resistance fighters, but it never achieved the narrative prominence of stories about military operations or partisan warfare that fit more comfortably into conventional frameworks of World War II history. The Holocaust itself became compressed in popular understanding into images of concentration camps and gas chambers, the industrial machinery of genocide that shocked the world when it was revealed in 1945. The resistance, the fighting, the moments when victims became warriors, these elements were acknowledged but rarely centered in the historical narrative. And Shimon's story, like so many others, survived primarily in family memory and fragmentary documentation, waiting for a time when people might be ready to hear it not as a footnote, but as what it actually was. Evidence that even in humanity's darkest hour, courage and ingenuity could manifest in forms that defied every attempt to reduce people to categories of victim or perpetrator. Shimon died in 2008 at the age of 78, having lived long enough to see the State of Israel established, to watch his children and grandchildren grow up in a world where Jewish people had sovereignty and self-defense, and to witness the slow transformation of Holocaust memory from lived experience to historical study. At his funeral, his oldest grandson found the bullet among his grandfather's possessions and asked what it meant. The family explained, passing down the story one more time, ensuring that the memory would survive for at least one more generation. The bullet is now in a museum in Jerusalem, displayed alongside a photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto and a brief plaque explaining its significance. Visitors pass by it every day, most of them unaware of the full story it represents. The impossible moment when a 13-year-old boy with nothing but a mirror and then a serving tray fought back against industrial genocide and survived to bear witness. This is why we tell these stories, not because they change the fundamental tragedy of the Holocaust or redeem the suffering of millions, but because they remind us that human agency persists even in the most constrained circumstances, that resistance is possible even when victory is not, and that the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil deserves to be remembered not as mythology, but as historical fact. The boy who blinded the shadow is gone, but his story finally has been told.